It happened in less than 5 seconds. A tear of fabric, a glimpse of skin, and the commander's eyes widened like he'd just seen a ghost. That tattoo wasn't decoration, it was a death warrant with coordinates, and her name wasn't on it. He didn't mean to tear it all the way, at least that's what he'd tell the investigation later, but fabric doesn't care about lies, and truth doesn't ask permission. The cotton split with a hiss, the room exhaled, and the commander's hand went rigid on instinct, because the tattoo he'd uncovered on her back wasn't a tattoo. It was his signature. Stop. Rewind 10 seconds. If you blinked, you missed it. A normal-looking girl in a plain base t-shirt, head down, eyes averted. The kind of quiet that turns invisible in crowded places. Her name on the roster meant nothing to most temporary logistics. Tech, rotating through inventory, reconciling barcodes with crates and crates with ghosts. The warehouse smelled like oil and old rain. Light fell in tired stripes from high windows, and forklifts kept their conversation short. She was a shape among shapes, a breath among breath. The kind of person who gets miscounted at muster and no one notices. Until today, until him. He thought the base was a stage and every person on it a prop. He'd rehearsed this small cruelty before, thinly veiled as discipline, wrapped in words like standards, decorum, and respect. For rank, the mess hall whispered about it behind styrofoam coffee lids. If the commander took an interest, it was safer to become a wall. She wasn't a wall, she was a mirror. So when he stepped into her space in the inventory cage, voice clipped, breath sharp, and barked about her sloppy uniform, her silence felt like defiance. When he reached for her shoulder seam and tugged, the world paused. Then the seam gave way. Cotton surrendered, air touched skin, and he saw it. Not a rose, not wings, not the usual ornamental bravado that soldiers trade like stories in ink. It was geometry that made your eyes ache. A broken triangle nested in a circle. A star collapsed inward. A string of numbers curving like a question mark. It was lines inside lines, engraved into her skin, so fine you'd swear you could hear them hum. He stumbled back one half step, the kind of step a man takes when he recognizes his own handwriting on a confession letter he never wrote. The warehouse. Swallowed sound. Somewhere outside the chain link cage, a forklift beeped twice, uncertain. The light above them flickered just once like a heartbeat skipping. You want to know why he knew it. You want to know why a man who wore every medal the regulations could hold suddenly looked like a boy whose candle had just blown out. Because some marks are not ink. Some marks are permissions. And some marks are doors. She pulled the fabric forward across her shoulder, slow, deliberate, like closing a book you never meant anyone to read. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. Her hands were steady. She watched him the way shoreline watches a storm, and moved, patient, ancient. He swallowed hard, and the sound echoed against metal shelving and coil-bound manifest logs and decades of secrets. He remembered a briefing room with the lights lowered to a hum, a slide that was never printed, a directive that was never filed. He remembered a name for a program that didn't exist. He remembered the small note. If you see the mark, stop. If you touch the marked, you've already failed. He had failed. The cameras in the cage blinked red, then went still. Anyone who says machines don't get nervous has never been in a room where the truth arrived on foot. They both knew what was going to happen next, and neither of them moved first. You expect shouting. You expect apologies. You expect a man to try to paste authority over fear like a bandage over a broken bone. That's not what happened. He breathed in, sharp and thin, and said her name as if tasting it for the first time. He'd read it a dozen times on shift rosters and inspection sheets. On his tongue it felt different now, like a password he shouldn't have. Noor, he said, and the sound of it made the air feel heavier. Sir, she said, polite, flat, a word that meant exactly nothing. He motioned vaguely at the mark. "Where did you get that?" A smile almost appeared at the corner of her mouth. Not joy, not mockery. Recognition. "Where do any of us get anything that matters?" Her voice was low, even. The kind that can slip under a door and into a locked room. "We survived something." He stared at the numbers arcing through the symbol, those impossible, aching digits that looped like a river finding its old bed after a flood. He knew them, every night at 17 for the last 13 years. He'd woken with them buzzing behind his eyes. Coordinates, then codes, then dates. The tattoo assembled them into a shape that meant you were there, and so was I, or maybe you. Thought it ended. It didn't. He tried again, grasping for a railing in the dark. "Who authorized?" She stepped past him, gentle as a summer correction. "The same entity that authorized your last promotion. The same entity that sealed the record for Operation Kestrel and called it a weather report." She didn't look back. "If you want to keep pretending this is about a uniform standard, you can. But you already know it isn't." He wanted to say her name again. He wanted to ask who she really was. He wanted to tear the cameras out of the corners like teeth and chew them into quiet. Instead, he followed her out of the cage, shoes whispering on the concrete. Outside, the base kept moving. Men cursed at stuck pallet jacks. Boots knocked out a rhythm on metal grating. A helicopter stitched the sky with thread only nerves can see. Somewhere, a radio stuttered and died mid-sentence. Somewhere, a door locked itself from the outside. Rumors move faster than forklifts. By the time they reached the mezzanine catwalk above Bay 3, eyes had turned quick and then away. People who could not have seen the tattoo were already making space for it. The way you step around a chalk outline that isn't there yet. Nor walk to the rail and look down at the crates stenciled with lies. He stood a pace behind, watching the place where her shoulder blade met the line of her spine. Beneath the ray-gathered fabric, he knew if he closed his eyes he'd still see the mark, fine lines humming, numbers singing. He kept them open. "Why here?" he asked. "Why now?" She tilted her head, listening to something he couldn't hear. "Because the counter stops today." He almost laughed. It came out, strangled. "What counter?" She didn't turn. "The one you started the night you signed the red folder and told yourself you were saving the base. The unit, the nation, any word big enough to drown your own name. The counter that ticks down between the first wrong thing and the last chance to put it right." He remembered the red folder. He remembered rain beating the flight line into a sheet of sound. He remembered the brief where the man with no rank introduced the variable with no face. He remembered saying yes, because saying yes has its own gravity. He remembered her. Not here. Not now. Not as Noor. A different name, shorter, harder. A code name that tasted like iron. He remembered an alley with snow melting into black water. A girl wrapped in a thermal blanket while men argued about logistics, policy, optics. He had stood back then exactly where he stood now, one pace behind a woman whose existence would decide whether he slept or didn't. He had told himself he was doing the right thing. He had sent her away under an escort that didn't have a patch. He blinked. The mezzanine rail sharpened into something that could cut. "You were supposed to be gone." The smile almost returned to her voice. "A lot of us were supposed to be." A tech in the bay below tilted a crate, and something inside knocked once, hollow as a rib cage. The sound rose and fell. Nora's shoulders loosened. "They moved the evidence here," she said. And for the first time he heard something like approval, like the base had accidentally done him a favor. He stepped to the rail beside her, his knuckles white now and obvious. Evidence of what? She turned. In her eyes, he saw a horizon he had once convinced himself didn't exist. Of the people you couldn't protect and the orders you obeyed. That never should have been written. Of a black budget operation that learned to eat its own tail. Of a thin line where classified becomes convenient. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped, and immediately hated the sound of it. Anger is a life raft that turns into an anchor as soon as you hold on. I think you do, she said. I think you've always known. I think that's why you could recognize a mark you were never meant to see twice. She let the next sentence fall like a coin into a well. I think that's why you stopped. Footsteps approached two MPs called by some half-witness who thought procedure was the same thing as safety. They slowed when they saw the commander. Training held their faces still. Instinct pulled them back a fraction. Noor glanced at them and then past them, as if reading the air behind their shoulders. You should send them away, she said softly, not to him so much as to the room itself. He waved the MPs off. They didn't want any of what this was. They were grateful not to have to invent a report for it. Noor leaned on the rail. There will be a blackout in 11 minutes. She didn't check a watch during that blackout. Someone will try to move the crate with the blue chalk X off-site. They'll do it under cover of a training flight. They think if they can change the inventory by one line, they can change the story by a chapter. He found his voice hiding under old habits. How do you know that? She took a slow breath. Because the person who planned it is the same person who designed the algorithm that fails the cameras in your inventory cage. When they see the shape, she tapped her shoulder blade. Gentle. Because the counter stops today. The line between him and the person he had been sharpened until it hummed. He wanted to ask her what the tattoo meant in the part of the world without maps. He wanted to ask why the numbers curved instead of running straight. He wanted to ask if he was allowed to help. You are, she said into his silence, answering the question he hadn't risked. But it can't look like you are. He nodded once. A motion calibrated for cameras that weren't watching. Tell me what to do. Her eyes warmed by 1 degree. Start by letting the people you trust think they're disobeying you. Then give them the right thing to disobey. He moved like someone learning to walk again. Orders went out in his voice, but not his handwriting. A loading bay was closed for a spill. A manifest was misprinted and needed to be re-signed by a clerk who happened to owe him a favor. A flight line was delayed due to a weather cell that radar couldn't see because it didn't exist. People who had learned to breathe on his cues started to hold their breath at different times, and a pattern emerged, the kind you can only see from above or inside a story. 11 minutes later, the lights went out. Darkness isn't nothing. It's sound and heat, and the way people decide who they are when no one can see them. Boots accelerated, radios stuttered, then jammed into static. A helicopter chewed the air, then thought better of it and set its teeth down. Somewhere, a hand found a back it shouldn't. Somewhere else, a hand moved away. On the far side of Bay 3, a door whispered open. A dolly rolled. 2 silhouettes pushed. Noor didn't move. She closed her eyes like counting the spaces between thunder and lightning. There, she said, and he could tell exactly where she meant. He didn't run. He didn't need to. He had already put the right people in the path of the wrong plan. A forklift that shouldn't have been parked exactly where it was coughed to life without headlights. A pallet slid. A dolly stopped. Somebody swore the way a man swears when he realizes he's memorized the wrong map. In the dark, the crate with the blue chalk X stayed exactly where the truth had nailed it down. The lights returned in a shrug, half-hearted, embarrassed, like a lie caught mid-sentence. Noor opened her eyes. In the rail-lit space, the men who had tried to move the crate discovered they had grown labels on their chests that said, "We don't work here anymore." The MPs came back the way tides do when the moon remembers them. Papers were collected. Phones were quietly turned face down. The base rearranged itself to make room for consequences. He breathed. It felt like first air after too long underwater. "It won't hold," he said quietly, not to discourage, but to admit the size of the room. If they sealed Kestrel once, they can seal this too. They could, she agreed, if we let them write it first. He looked at her, really looked, and realized the part of him that had carried the red folder around for 13 years like a bone in his pocket had been waiting to hand it to her. "What's on that crate?" She touched the rail again. "Names." Then, after a beat, "And proof that names still matter." He closed his eyes just once to feel the weight of that sentence. When he opened them, the world was the same size but felt more honest. They walked the long way down by stairs that had counted men up and down, by walls that had watched more apologies than confessions. At the bay floor, the blue X stared back up at them like a pupil. Noor crouched, pressed her palm to the plywood as if testing a pulse, then stood. "You should open it," she said. He shook his head. "You should. Not my command," she said softly. "Not my sin to wash." He signaled the clerk. The crowbar squealed like an old opinion. Nails released. The lid came up. Inside, beneath packing straw that pretended to be shy, lay 3 binders and a hard case the color of a decision. He recognized the format even before he saw the heading. Custrel, Financial Instruments, Witness Protection Overrides, Biometrics. His mouth went dry. He reached for the nearest binder the way a man reaches for a letter that might absolve him or put him on trial. The first page contained a list of names, a neat ladder down the left margin, dates beside them like shadows, locations that had been redacted and then unredacted by a hand that understood both those arts. In the third column, an annotation, Mark, Vesper Triad Collapse Star Plus Coordinate Arc. A photo paperclip to the bottom showed a back someone else's, not Noor's, with the same fine line tattoo humming on skin. His hands trembled. "They cataloged us," she said. The word "us" slid into place like a key. Every witness they pulled, every asset they burned, every child they stamped with a proof of life mark when they ran out of trust and thought maybe geometry could do what decency wouldn't. He turned the page, and the next, until a name appeared that pulled the floor 6 inches lower. Nordal. The rest redacted. Then unredacted. Date, location, status retained. Not protected, not placed, retained. Filed like a spare part. He said her name again, this time as a question that wished it could be a prayer. Noor. She didn't flinch, but the air around her seemed to. "They made me a ledger," she said. "I learned to become a margin." He reached for the hard case. The combination lock looked ordinary, which meant it wasn't. He'd seen this pattern once in a room where questions were multiple choice, and every answer was wrong. He turned it. 0-17. The number that had woken him for 13 years. The latch surrendered with a click that felt like a season changing. Inside, drives, chip-embedded ID blanks, a brushed steel device that looked like a lighter but carried the weight of an executioner's stamp. He lifted it. On the base, the same broken triangle, the same star collapsed inward, the same arc of numbers. He pressed the catch. The head glowed faintly, the color of decisions you can never unmake. "It's not ink," she said, voice barely above the breath of the room. "Micro-etching at a temperature that scars only what you can't see in daylight. Under normal light, it looks like art. Under the right wavelength, it reads like a courtroom." He angled the device toward her shoulder without touching her. The fine lines answered ghost bright, sudden, a confession written in stars. And there, nested inside the geometry, a string of letters arranged like a verdict, authorizing officer, C. Rourke. His name, not printed, burned, not accusation, ownership. For a moment, the base disappeared. There was only a man and the thing he had done and the woman who had carried it like a map through a desert he had drawn. He felt something inside him, carefully, preserved for years, crack wide enough to let the wind in. He lowered the device. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't deserve to. He did the only true thing he could. "Tell me how we fix this." She considered him as if measuring whether a bridge could carry a convoy. "We don't fix it," she said. "We end it, and then we begin something else." "What does ending it look like?" "Light." she said simply. "The kind that makes secrets decide whether they're truths or mistakes." He nodded once. Somewhere in the building, his earlier orders were becoming paperwork. And paperwork had a way of becoming law when the right eyes signed it. But paper would not be enough. He knew the men who could make any word mean the opposite of itself if you let them. He looked at the drives. He looked at the binders. He looked at the mark glowing faintly under a device that had pretended to be a lighter for too long. He reached for the radio on his belt and then didn't. He turned to the clerk instead, young, brittle, still human. "I need a sat phone," he said quietly. "Not the base network. The real one." 10 minutes later, he was speaking into a voice that didn't say its name. He said words he had never arranged in that order. "I am the authorizing officer on a program that doesn't exist. I am invoking sunset under the integrity clause you pretend isn't there. I have witnesses. I have chain of custody. And I have your device with my name inside a stranger's skin. If you try to seal this, understand, it's already open. Silence. On the line is a language." He heard the syntax of surprise, the pause of recalculation, the quiet decision to escalate or retreat. When the voice returned, it had moved to inches lower in its seat. "Proceed," it said. The machine began to eat itself. Not in a frenzy, in a process. Files were requested in triplicate. Offices that had been untouchable developed doorknobs. Men who had been ceremonial found out their uniforms. Could get them into rooms again, rooms that needed sweeping, not admiration. The base became an address, not a fortress. And evidence learned to walk. You want the moment of adrenaline, the sudden sprint, the chase, the shout. You'll get it. Even dying snakes bite. The firefight didn't happen with guns. It happened with signals. Phones hiccuped, then lit up with unfamiliar area codes. A drone that wasn't on any manifest tried to declare an emergency landing on the far strip where cameras failed twice a week. Today, they worked like they'd been waiting their whole lives. A colonel from another state arrived on a plane that had no passengers and left with a face that had one regret less. Someone tried to erase a block of servers. Someone else had already written the same data inside a private email to a senator who owed a debt to a night 30 years ago when someone he loved needed a pilot who could fly in the dark dot. And through all of that, Norm moved like a quiet ritual, making sure the people who didn't need to be brave weren't asked to be, making sure the ones who had to be brave weren't alone. She drank water when it mattered. She rested her eyes for 60 seconds against a column and stood up with more room in her lungs. She didn't sermonize. She didn't gloat. She watched the counter, and when it hit 0, she smiled for the first time in a way he recognized not as victory, but as survival. He found her at dusk on the outside steps that faced the airfield. The sky wore the day's last bruise. The wind smelled like dust and new paper. He sat beside her and didn't pretend he belonged there. After a while, he spoke. "There'll be trials," he said. "There'll be people who call this a witch hunt. There'll be people who call you a liar." She nodded. "There'll also be people who sleep tonight." He looked at her shoulder, thinking of a device that turned truth into light. "Does it ever stop humming?" she considered. "Not for me," she said. "But that's the point. It was meant to make me an inventory item. Instead it made me a lighthouse." He swallowed. "I can resign. You can testify," she said. "You can mentor the kid who thinks cutting corners is what adulthood is. You can write the memo that becomes a manual so the next person who sees a mark like mine doesn't have to guess which choice costs less of their soul. You can resign too, if that's honest. But your resignation is not a gift to me. Truth is." He nodded, because there are some orders that outrank all others. Night put its hand gently on the bass. Somewhere, a radio played a song that didn't quite reach them. The steps held them like a promise they had not yet fully learned to keep. He cleared his throat. The last question had been waiting since the warehouse, since the first tear in the seam, since before the red folder. "Why me?" he asked. Not pleading, not proud, just puzzled. "Why come back here? Why show me?" She looked out at the runway lights. "Because once, when you didn't know anyone was watching, you told a private to go home at 00:00 and call his mother. You wrote him up the next day for something stupid so no one would think you'd gone soft. He still called. She still answered. The thing you were protecting wasn't your image. It was a person. I don't bet on symbols. I bet on habits." He blinked against a sting that had nothing to do with wind. "I don't remember that. You're not supposed to," she said. And there was more kindness than judgment in it. "But he does." They sat. The runway lights blinked like patient eyes. Somewhere on base, an alarm chirped once and then reconsidered the value of drama. In the near distance, the crate with the blue X became numbers on a log, then a case file. Then if the people they had called did their jobs, pages in a record that would finally be read. Eventually, he stood. "Will I see you again?" The question felt childish and honest at the same time. She stood too. "You will hear me," she said. "When you hear yourself ask whether the easier thing is the right one. If you choose the harder thing, that's me. If you choose the easier thing, that was never me." He almost smiled. "Where will you go?" She lifted one shoulder in the smallest shrug. "Where the next counter is closest to 0. He wanted to salute and didn't. He wanted to apologize again and didn't. He wanted to say thank you and did. "Thank you," he said, like a man who had finally found the right word. She stepped down the stairs, her outline calm against a world that had remembered how to breathe. And as she passed under a motion sensor, the light above the door warmed to life, quiet, soft, like permission. For a moment, the fabric against her shoulder shifted, and the tat beneath it hummed where only she could hear. A mark that had been meant to brand her into silence had become a tuning fork for courage. She walked into the dark like it was a room she owned. The next morning, on a desk that had held more excuses than answers, a memo waited. It was addressed to no one and everyone. Subject: Sunset Protocol. Witness: mark recognition and immediate actions. The first line came in his handwriting. "If you see the mark, stop. If you touch the marked, you've already failed." Under it, new lines, new orders, written for a world that had watched and learned. Somewhere in the margins, if you held the paper up to the light, you could see a faint arc of numbers, coordinates not to a place, but to a choice you could find from anywhere. The investigation would take months. The news would mispronounce names. People who had never cared would care too loudly. People who had always cared would speak softly. He would testify. He would resign. He would mentor. He would write manuals. He would be cursed by those who built their careers on locked doors. He would be thanked by some he would never meet. And when the nights woke him at 17, the numbers would still be there, but they would sit differently in his skull now, not as a sentence, but as a song whose last note had finally been found. As for Noor, you'll ask where she ended up. There are stories of a woman with a quiet voice in a disaster tent, telling a quartermaster that the list is lying and handing him the truth. Of a figure on a pier at dawn, watching a container ship more closely than law requires and exactly as closely as justice does. Of a passenger in a rental car, reading a printout upside down and smiling when she finds the one line that didn't realize it could be honest. None of those stories have seen labels. None of them have credits. They are told the way the right things are done, carefully, with both hands. If you want an ending, you won't get one. You'll get a continuation. The kind that starts when a scene tears and a mark hums and a man remembers. That rank without conscience is just a costume. The kind that starts when a girl who learned to become invisible decides it's time to be seen. And not for herself, but for the ones whose names were almost lost to the logic of locked doors. So if you ever find yourself in a room where the Lights flicker and a truth steps in on quiet feet. Remember this: fabric tears, cameras fail, and rumors run. None of it matters. What matters is whether the first person who recognizes the mark chooses to be smaller than his fear or larger than his past. He chose on a mezzanine above a blue chalk X, and the world, in its slow, stubborn way, turned toward that choice and took a step. How was the story? If you felt the goosebumps, if you breathed with them in the dark and believed the light could still win, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.